On the damp morning of April 14th, 1983, a line of battered livestock trailers rolled through the back roads of Adair County, Iowa, carrying 60 pigs that no respectable orchard owner would have wanted. Their ears were scarred from crowded pens. Their hides were caked with dried mud. A few limped as they stepped on the gravel beside a dying apple orchard outside the small town of Greenfield. The neighbors watched from their pickups. Some folded their arms. Others shook their heads. Every one of them believed they were looking at the final mistake of Margaret Ellis, a 72-year-old widow who had spent nearly 5 decades working the same 80-acre farm without ever asking anyone to feel sorry for her. Margaret climbed down from the cab of her faded 1968 Chevrolet C20 as slowly as sunrise. Her hands looked older than the rest of her, thick with ridges carved by years of pruning branches, repairing fences, and tightening rusty bolts with wrenches that had belonged to her husband. Her boots carried the reddish soil of the orchard like they had for nearly 40 years. She didn't hurry. She never had. People who knew Margaret often said you could tell what kind of day it would be by the speed of her walk. Calm days were slow. Hard days were slower. The orchard itself looked exhausted. Nearly 300 Jonathan and red delicious apple trees stood across 12 acres, but many had thin crowns and pale leaves. Grass barely grew between the rows. Rainwater pooled instead of soaking into the earth. Every harvest had become smaller than the one before. Local experts blamed age. A county advisor suggested removing every tree and starting over. The estimate came to $18,400, money Margaret simply did not have. Instead, she bought pigs, not prize-winning pigs, not expensive breeding stock. Just 60 unwanted feeder hogs purchased for $31 each from a livestock auction in Winnisett, Iowa. The decision spread across the county before lunchtime. Let me tell you about Margaret Ellis. She wasn't born into wealth. Her father milked dairy cows through the Great Depression, teaching his children that land remembered every kindness and every shortcut. Margaret married Harold Ellis in 1947. The same spring, he bought a used 1949 Farmall M, a 44-horsepower tractor that cost him $1,800, nearly every dollar they had saved. Harold used a wipe it to clean before every planting season, saying machines work harder when people respected them. After Harold died from a heart attack in 1978, Margaret kept the tractor running alone. Every oil change was written in a small notebook. Every grease fitting received attention before sunrise. She spoke to that machine more often than she spoke to most people. The Farmall still started on cold mornings with a deep, steady rumble that echoed across the orchard. It wasn't simply equipment anymore. It carried fingerprints that no longer existed. By noon, more trucks had gathered near the fence. Among them stood Daniel Brooks, 34 years old, vice president of Brooks Agricultural Development, a company buying worn-out family farms across southwest Iowa. Daniel wore polished boots that had never stepped into a muddy hog lot. He believed efficiency solved everything. Bigger sprayers, bigger tractors, bigger loans, bigger profits. He looked over the fence as the pigs rooted into the hard ground. Then he laughed, not a polite chuckle, a loud laugh that rolled across the orchard until everyone standing nearby joined him. "You've lost your orchard," Daniel said between laughs. "And now you're turning it into a pig pen." Several neighbors laughed harder. One man slapped the side of his truck. Another removed his cap to wipe tears from his eyes. Someone whispered, "She's finally gone crazy." Margaret never answered immediately. She rested both hands on the old Farmall steering wheel, watching the pigs spread beneath the trees. Some rooted around fallen apples left from the previous autumn. Others pushed their noses into compacted earth, breaking apart crust that hadn't loosened in years. Finally, she looked toward Daniel. "They're working," she said quietly. "They're destroying it," he replied. Margaret smiled only with her eyes. "We'll see." There wasn't a trace of anger in her voice. No attempt to defend herself. No speech about experience. Just confidence, so calm it made silence feel heavier than shouting. The crowd drifted away before evening, convinced they had witnessed a final chapter of an old woman's stubbornness. But the pigs stayed. Every morning they rooted. Every afternoon they turned another strip of hardened soil. Every evening, Margaret moved portable fencing another few yards, so the animals worked fresh ground instead of destroying one place. People still laughed. The laughter followed her into the feed store, into church on Sunday, into the hardware shop where she bought replacement fence staples. Daniel heard every joke. He repeated a few himself, because from everything modern agriculture taught him, pigs belonged in pens, not beneath apple trees. Let me tell you about orchards. Healthy fruit trees don't simply need fertilizer. They need living soil filled with worms, fungi, insects, air pockets, and billions of microscopic organisms working together below the surface. Once heavy equipment compresses that soil year after year, rain cannot sink properly, roots struggle to breathe, and trees slowly starve despite standing in perfectly good ground. Sometimes the fastest way to heal land is not another machine. Sometimes it begins with animals doing exactly what nature designed them to do. Margaret understood that long before scientists started using the phrase regenerative agriculture. She had learned it from her grandfather in 1951, when pigs cleaned an abandoned pasture better than any plow. She never forgot the lesson. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless, only to discover later it held the answer everyone else had missed? By early May, tiny changes began appearing beneath the orchard trees. Most people never noticed them. Daniel Brooks did, and what he saw that morning made him stop laughing. By the second week of May 1983, the orchard looked different in ways that only people who truly watched the land could recognize. The change wasn't dramatic. There were no towering weeds or sudden explosions of green. Instead, the earth had begun to soften. Rain no longer sat in shallow puddles for days. It disappeared into the ground within hours. Small earthworms appeared beneath clumps of loosened soil where none had been seen for years. Daniel Brooks noticed it during a routine visit to inspect a neighboring property his company hoped to purchase. He parked beside the fence. He didn't laugh this time. He simply watched. The pigs moved slowly between the apple trees, noses buried in the ground, turning over dead grass, old leaves, and years of compacted earth. Margaret followed behind them with a roll of portable fencing strapped to the back of the old 1949 Farmall M. The tractor's engine carried the same deep rhythm it had carried for more than 3 decades. It wasn't fast. It wasn't quiet. But it never sounded uncertain. You're still convinced this will work? Daniel asked. Margaret climbed down from the tractor and brushed dirt from her gloves. I don't need to be convinced, she replied. The ground already is. Daniel looked across the orchard. I still don't understand. Margaret smiled. I know. Let me tell you about Harold Ellis. Harold believed every machine had a purpose, but every machine also had a limit. Whenever neighbors rushed to buy larger equipment because advertisements promised higher yields, Harold would simply grease another fitting on the Farmall and go back to work. He often said the expensive part of farming wasn't buying machinery. It was forgetting how the land wanted to be treated. Margaret heard those words thousands of times during their marriage. After he was gone, they became part of the way she thought. Daniel wasn't stubborn. He was educated. He had graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in agricultural business. He understood finance, fertilizer recommendations, equipment depreciation, and production forecasts. Everything he knew suggested Margaret should remove every tree, rip the soil with heavy equipment, apply commercial fertilizer, and replant. What he didn't understand was that Margaret wasn't trying to fight nature. She was asking nature to help. Around town, people continued talking. The coffee shop conversations became predictable. How are the orchard pigs? Heard she's raising bacon instead of apples. Guess retirement finally caught up with her. Most of the remarks weren't cruel, just confident. Confident people often mistake confidence for truth. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by again, carrying a soil probe. I'd like to test something, he admitted. Margaret nodded. Go ahead. He pushed the steel probe into an area the pigs had already worked. It slid into the ground with surprising ease. He walked 20 yards farther to an untouched section beyond the portable fence. This time he had to force his weight onto the handle before the probe finally entered. He frowned. The difference was impossible to ignore. Let me tell you about soil compaction. Many people believe plants only need water and fertilizer. They don't. Roots also need oxygen. When tractors, trucks, and years of weather compress soil, tiny air spaces disappear. Water runs off instead of soaking in, and roots struggle to spread. Pigs naturally loosen the surface while searching for roots, insects, and leftover fruit. Their manure adds nutrients, but their real gift is restoring the structure beneath your feet. Healthy soil is less like concrete and more like a sponge. Once that sponge begins working again, everything above it changes. Daniel stood quietly after finishing his measurements. "I've never seen numbers like this," he admitted. Margaret simply looked toward the trees. They're breathing again. Over the next several weeks, another change appeared. Grass returned. Not everywhere, just scattered patches between the rows. Then clover, then wildflowers. Honeybees arrived before anyone expected them. The orchard sounded different. Instead of silence, there was movement, buzzing, birdsong, the rustle of insects beneath fresh growth. Margaret noticed every sound. Daniel noticed something else. The leaves on several trees had become darker, healthier, not perfect, but unmistakably stronger than they had looked in April. He returned home that evening carrying a notebook full of observations instead of opinions. Have you ever watched something so small happen that everyone else ignored it, yet somehow you knew it would change everything? By early June, neighboring farmers began slowing their trucks whenever they passed the Ellis orchard. Some rolled down their windows. Some climbed out for a closer look. None of them laughed. Not anymore. Word eventually reached the Adair County Extension Office. A field specialist scheduled a visit after hearing unusual reports about pigs being used to restore an aging orchard instead of clearing it. Daniel happened to arrive the same morning. The specialist walked between the rows, dug several inspection holes, examined root growth, and scribbled notes for nearly 2 hours without saying much. Finally, he stood beside Margaret. "When was the last commercial fertilizer application?" he asked. 3 years ago. He looked surprised. "And pesticides?" "Only when absolutely necessary." The specialist slowly nodded. Then he turned toward Daniel. "You've been monitoring this?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes." "What do you think?" Daniel looked across the orchard where 60 pigs continued working beneath trees everyone had nearly given up on. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then he took a slow breath. "I think," he began. Before he could finish, a worker came running from the far end of the orchard, pointing toward one of the oldest apple trees. Every head turned. The branch was covered with something nobody expected to see that early in the season. The worker reached the tree out of breath. "You need to see this," he said, pointing upward. Margaret walked over without rushing. Daniel followed close behind. The county field specialist adjusted his glasses and stepped beneath the broad limbs of one of the oldest Jonathan apple trees in the orchard. For years it had produced only a handful of undersized apples. Half the county expected it to die before another harvest. Now its branches were covered with clusters of healthy young fruit. Not dozens. Hundreds. No one spoke for several seconds. The specialist reached up, gently touched one of the tiny apples, then looked down at the soil around the trunk. It was loose, dark, and alive with earthworms. "I wasn't expecting this," he admitted quietly. Neither was Daniel. He had come prepared to document a curious experiment. Instead, he was watching years of assumptions unravel beneath a single tree. Margaret rested one weathered hand against the trunk. "They've been waiting," she said softly. "Waiting for what?" Daniel asked. "For the ground to remember how to breathe." The word stayed with him long after everyone returned to work. Let me tell you about patience. Modern farming often measures success by the season. Profit this year. Yield this year. Efficiency this year. But older farmers understood something different. Soil keeps its own calendar. A mistake made over 10 years cannot always be repaired in 10 weeks. Likewise, land that has been cared for faithfully may reward someone long after the person who planted it is gone. Margaret never expected miracles. She expected slow, honest improvement. That was enough. By late June, more changes appeared. The clover spread between the rows. Butterflies returned. Wild birds scratched through the freshly turned ground behind the pigs, feeding on insects that had hidden beneath the compacted soil for years. The orchard no longer felt silent. It felt awake. News traveled farther than Adair County. A reporter from a regional agricultural newspaper arrived carrying a camera and more skepticism than curiosity. He photographed the pigs. He photographed the old Farmall M. Then he asked Margaret the question everyone else seemed to ask. Did you really believe 60 pigs could save an orchard? Margaret smiled. I believe the orchard could save itself. The reporter frowned. I don't understand. You don't have to, she replied. You only have to look. The article appeared the following week. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't glowing either. Its headline simply asked whether livestock might play a larger role in restoring worn-out farmland. For Daniel, that article marked a turning point. He found himself defending Margaret during conversations at the grain elevator. Maybe we judge too quickly, he told another land investor. The man laughed. You're serious? I am. You used to call it the craziest idea in the county. Daniel nodded. I was wrong. Those 3 words surprised even him. They were harder to say than he'd imagined. Have you ever realized the person you doubted was quietly teaching you all along? By August, the orchard carried more fruit than it had in nearly a decade. The apples were larger. The leaves stayed green despite the summer heat. Even trees that had seemed beyond saving showed fresh growth. The county specialist returned with new soil tests. Organic matter had increased. Water infiltration had improved dramatically. Beneficial insects were thriving. He looked at Margaret with genuine admiration. I'll be discussing this at the state conference. She chuckled softly. Tell them it wasn't my idea. It wasn't. No, it was the land's. Daniel spent more time at the orchard than at his own office. Sometimes he helped move fencing. Sometimes he simply watched the pigs work. One evening, he noticed Margaret carefully greasing the fittings on the old Farmall. You never miss one, do you? He asked. She wiped excess grease from the fitting with an old cloth. This tractor buried my husband. Daniel looked confused. She smiled gently. It also carried him through 30 harvests. She rested her hand on the faded red hood. Machines remember how they're treated. He looked across the chipped paint and worn seat. The tractor wasn't beautiful. It wasn't restored. Every dent carried a story. Every scratch belonged to someone who had worked instead of polished. For the first time in his life, Daniel understood why people became attached to old equipment. It wasn't because they feared change. It was because some things earned the right to stay. Then September arrived. Harvest inspectors estimated the Ellis orchard might produce nearly twice the previous year's crop. Buyers who had ignored Margaret for years suddenly called asking about contracts. Neighbors who once laughed stopped by with homemade pies, fresh vegetables, and awkward apologies. One by one, they admitted they had been wrong. Margaret accepted every apology exactly the same way, with kindness, never once reminding anyone what they had said in April. One afternoon, Daniel stood beside her as workers loaded the first bins of apples. I owe you an apology, too, he said. You already gave it. When? The day you started asking questions instead of making speeches. Daniel laughed quietly. This time it wasn't the loud, mocking laugh that had echoed across the orchard months earlier. It was the laugh of a man discovering there was still something left to learn. Just then, a pickup truck pulled into the lane, carrying a representative from a large agricultural development company in Des Moines. He stepped out holding a folder. I'd like to make you an offer for this entire property, he said. Margaret looked at the orchard, then at the pigs, then at the old Farmall resting beneath the shade of an apple tree. She listened carefully. When the man finally named the price, Daniel's eyes widened. He had never heard anyone offer that much money for 80 acres in Adair County. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She simply removed her gloves, folded them carefully into her pocket, and looked back toward the oldest tree in the orchard. Then she spoke 5 quiet words that left everyone standing there completely speechless. I'm not selling this farm. The words were quiet. They always were. Yet they carried farther than any raised voice could have. The representative from Des Moines blinked in surprise. He had expected negotiations. He had expected hesitation. He had even expected Margaret to ask for more money. Instead, she stood beneath the oldest apple tree in the orchard, one hand resting on its rough bark, while the autumn breeze carried the scent of ripe fruit through the rows. "It is more than a fair offer," he insisted. "I know," Margaret replied. "You can retire comfortably." She smiled. "I've been comfortable for years." Daniel watched the conversation. Without saying a word, only a few months earlier, he would have encouraged any farmer to accept such an offer. Land values were rising. Large operations were expanding. Small family orchards disappeared every season. Selling seemed practical. Now it felt like tearing a chapter from a family Bible. The representative eventually closed his folder. "I hope you never regret it." Margaret looked across the orchard where the 60 pigs rested beneath the trees after another day's work. "I won't." The trucks drove away before sunset. They never returned. Harvest began during the first week of October 1983. Neighbors who had once laughed now volunteered to help pick apples. Families brought children. Church members arrived with baskets and ladders. The orchard that seemed destined for abandonment became one of the busiest places in Adair County. When the final wagon reached the storage barn, the number surprised everyone. The Ellis orchard had produced nearly twice the previous year's harvest, with larger fruit, healthier trees, and fewer losses from disease than anyone had predicted that spring. Even the county extension specialist admitted he had underestimated what healthy soil could accomplish. Daniel stood beside the old Farmall as workers finished loading the last crates. "I spent years studying agriculture," he said. Margaret nodded. "And today, I learned my biggest lesson from 60 pigs." She laughed softly. "No." He looked puzzled. "You learned it from listening." "Let me tell you about humility. It rarely arrives with applause. More often it appears after certainty falls apart. The strongest people are not those who never make mistakes. They are the ones willing to admit them, learn from them, and walk forward carrying wisdom instead of pride." Daniel discovered that truth in an Iowa orchard, not because someone embarrassed him, but because an elderly farmer gave him room to change. The following spring, several neighboring farms began experimenting with managed livestock, grazing in neglected orchards and worn-out fields. Not every attempt succeeded. Some copied the pigs without understanding the careful rotation Margaret practiced. Others expected instant results and became discouraged. Margaret welcomed every visitor. She answered every question. She never claimed to have invented anything. "The land knew long before I did," she often said. Daniel became one of her closest friends. Whenever someone laughed at an unusual farming idea during county meetings, he would quietly remind them of the Ellis orchard. "Look first," he would say. Laugh later. Most of the time, nobody laughed at all. 5 years passed. The old 1949 Farmall M still started every planting season. Its pain had faded even more, but the engine remained dependable because Margaret never ignored the little jobs that kept larger problems away. Oil changed on schedule. Grease where grease belonged. Bolts tightened before they loosened completely. Visitors often asked why she never traded it for a newer machine. She would pat the hood. "This one still keeps its promises." 10 years later, in 1993, Margaret finally slowed down. Age had stiffened her knees, but not her spirit. Her daughter, Helen, returned to farm after teaching school for many years. Together they cared for the orchard using the same careful rotation, the same respect for the soil, and the same old Farmall that Harold had purchased nearly half a century earlier. The pigs were different now. Not the original 60, of course, but every new generation worked the orchard in the same patient rhythm. The soil never returned to the lifeless condition it had once known. Daniel's own career changed as well. Instead of buying struggling farms to consolidate them, he began helping families restore them. He spoke at agricultural meetings throughout Iowa, often beginning with the same sentence. "I once laughed at the smartest farmer I ever met." People usually smiled. Then they listened. In the autumn of 1998, Margaret Ellis passed away peacefully in the farmhouse where she and Harold had spent most of their married life. She was 87 years old. The funeral filled the small church beyond capacity. Farmers came from several counties. Extension agents attended. Former skeptics stood beside lifelong friends. After the service, the procession passed the orchard. The Farmall rested beneath the oldest apple tree. Its engine was clean. Its tires carried fresh dust from that morning's work. Helen had driven it before the funeral because, as her mother always believed, farms should never stop living simply because someone is gone. Years became decades. Children who once picked apples there returned with children of their own. The orchard continued producing fruit. The Farmall continued running. Visitors still asked about the pigs. And someone always told the story of the spring, when an elderly widow ignored the laughter of an entire county and trusted the quiet work happening beneath the surface, because that had always been the real miracle. Not the pigs, not even the apples. The soil itself had come back to life. Some things don't become valuable because people finally notice them. They become valuable because someone cared for them long before anyone else understood their worth. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly proved everyone wrong, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or a friend, I would genuinely love to hear about them in the comments. Those are the stories that keep traditions alive long after headlines fade. And if you like another tale from the American countryside, the next one follows a farmer in rural Missouri who rescued a forgotten steam engine from a collapsed barn, only to discover it carried a family secret that had been buried for 40 years. I hope you'll join me for that one.